Hello everyone, I'm Inverse, and welcome to the second Company of Heroes 2 episode of StratTalk. Today we are going to be taking a look at the Soviet Tier 2, Tier 3 strategy that I showed in my first-person videocast, which I posted a few days ago. Let's jump into this first game. I've got two games for you today, and before we get into the analysis, I just want to point out that for every Company of Heroes 2 episode of StratTalk I record, I will be uploading the replays to CoH2.org and linking to them in the description of the video. So if you guys are interested in checking out the replays for yourselves, looking at the games a bit closely, or looking at it at your own pace, I recommend you guys check that out. Getting into this game though, this is a game against Barcelona Reborn, who is a vanilla Company of Heroes player, and it's on Pripyat, of course, so we won't have to worry about any blizzards, any cold tech, none of that kind of stuff. But we do have these choke points in the middle that we're going to have to worry about, which is a prime worry for any Soviet player, just because, of course, the Austere has a much stronger ability to control space, thanks to their MGs and their earlier mortars, since those mortars do come in Tier 1. As you'll notice, I skipped building a second engineer squad straight off the bat. Instead, I started straight on Conscripts, and I sent this first engineer squad to the closest fuel points on the map. This is something I do as Soviets, regardless of map, on both Kolodne, or however the heck you pronounce that. I don't think I'm pronouncing that right, but I don't know. I'm not Russian. Excuse me. The winter map. We'll call it the winter map. That makes it a lot easier. Both on that map and also on Pripyat. If I start on the right side here, I generally send my first engineer up here to the top. If I start on the left, I will send my first engineer down here. I like getting fuel started as quickly as possible as the Soviets, because this strategy does rely a little bit on fuel income. You need a bit of fuel to get your T-34s out at a decent time, and the T-34s are our main damage dealers in the mid-game, so it's important that we try and get them out as quickly as possible. Now, in terms of the general build, we're going to go 4 conscripts as fast as possible. We're going to follow that up with our in-base healing upgrade, and we're going to follow that up by a second engineer squad. Our first 60 munitions is going to go toward a flamer on this engineer squad. We're going to be a little bit passive and cautious in the early game with our attacks until we get that flamer. That flamer is the main damage dealer, and though it's not as big a deal on this map, because there aren't really defensive buildings that an opponent could hide in and stuff like that, it does become important on the winter map because of all the buildings in strategic locations. Now you'll notice right here I actually have a decent flank setup. This is an important part of sending a couple units to the top as well as sending a unit into the middle. It's fairly safe to assume that my opponent is going to have a MG squad over here. Now, I made a slight mistake right here. It probably, in hindsight, would have been smart to URA this conscript squad, and in doing so get past this MG, because if I had been able to get that conscript squad behind the MG before the MG repositioned to suppress it, I would have almost certainly been able to force that MG to retreat, and at the very least would have been able to do significant damage to it and forced it to move again, in which case I would have had another conscript squad coming in. I would have had this conscript squad that was suppressed, and I probably would have been able to push my opponent off this middle. But as it stands, that was a slight error that isn't going to affect things too significantly going later on in the game. Now, as you can see, I have my 4 conscripts right now. I have a very quick healing upgrade. We're not even at the 4-minute mark, and I have my healing upgrade. This is a very important upgrade for Soviets in the early game for a couple of reasons. First of all, we have high squad sizes, large squad sizes. We have 6-man squads for our conscripts, and of course the 4-man pioneers or engineer squads. Because of that, there's a greater likelihood of our infantry units spreading their damage out among different members of their squad, because each individual infantry man has a set amount of health, and if all of our infantry squads take half health damage, but none of them die, our entire squad's going to be at half health, but without any units any units dead. And that's a situation that you can absolutely exploit with healing, because it allows you to save a whole heck of a lot of manpower that you would otherwise be spending on reinforcing, and instead spending it on getting more units and teching up and stuff like that. Now my opponent's showing a desire to cap up this top left-hand side of the map. This is not at all uncommon for austere players on this map. It's a lot easier to lock down this side. As you'll notice, we actually have some annoyingly placed wire here. I am getting a minesweeper squad here, so after I build my tier 2 building, which is coming up right now, I will be cutting this wire, and that's going to give me another entryway into the middle here. But your opponent capping this top side is something you absolutely have to keep in mind. Now, one thing you can do to exploit it is what I'm doing right here, which is coming around the bottom and capping this point and also capping this point. These are, of course, not necessarily cutoffs in their own right, but when taken together, and in this situation, because my opponent, he has one MG here, I'm flanking it over here, so that's okay. I'll be able to force him to retreat. He has another MG up here I saw earlier. He also has a lot of his infantry up here. He can do one of two things right now. He can either divert a lot of his infantry back and take back his cutoffs, but at the same time leave these territories open and allow me to come back and cap them myself and in turn deny him resources once again. Or he can sit tight, hang out around here, wait for me to cap these, and then wait for me to move, and then come back in either with units he's freshly built from his base, probably coming from over here, or with units that are forced to retreat from engagements, or units that were already in his base. And that forces my opponent to react to me, which is something I always want to be doing, especially as the Soviets. A lot of people complain about the Soviet late game being extremely weak, and it is relatively weak, but what you should be keeping in mind is how you can exploit the early game in order to make that late game a little easier to deal with. That's the main goal of any Soviet early game, is not necessarily to win the game outright, but to make it easier for you going into the mid game and going into the late game to actually be aggressive and maintain your map control, because your map control is your biggest asset at that point in the game. I have decent map control right now. You'll notice my opponent is still cut off down here. He still has a fairly solid hold on the center. I'm trying to do a little bit of harassment, but failing slightly in that regard. He is also harassing down here at the bottom, which is excellent of him. However, if you'll notice, I have my tier 3 building up extremely quickly, 7 minutes and 45 seconds right now. I don't necessarily have the fuel just yet to get my T-34 out, but 10 fuel, so about half a minute or so I will have enough fuel to get that T-34 out. I'm also going to come in the middle here and just try and harass my opponent up top, harass my opponent in the middle, and push my opponent back on the bottom right here. Now, what I'm showing you is slightly different from what I showed in the first person video. If you'll notice, I have not teched to AT grenades yet. What I've found in terms of AT grenades is that their research time is sufficiently quick enough to allow them to be a reaction tech. And what I mean by that is I found it best to, instead of preemptively teching to AT grenades, in defense of my opponent having a vehicle on the way or some sort of tech that forces me to react to it, instead of doing it preemptively, I save my money and I'm able to tech to it reactively when my opponent shows me something that requires me to get sticky. So if my opponent shows me a scout car really early, I'll get stickies. If my opponent shows me a half track and I don't have enough fuel for a T-34, I'll probably get stickies. Once my opponent shows me he's either gone tier 3 or tier 4, then I'll get stickies. And it makes it a lot easier because this early in the game, not many players have their tech timings perfectly timed out, and it can be difficult to know when exactly it's worth it to preemptively tech up to something as situational as AT grenades, where they're definitely useful, but they're also not free. They cost fuel, which at this point in the game, going for a tech-based strategy, fuel is pretty much everything. It's incredibly important. You'll notice actually get my T-34 out before the 10-minute mark, which is a fairly quick T-34, all things considered. However, if you'll notice, my opponent's one sec. I'm going to show you something really dumb that you should never do. This is a very prime location for Teller mines. And we're going to see... boom. And that's a Teller mine. And this is something you should never do. Never, ever, ever drive your very first vehicle into a choke point. Also, don't lose infantry squads. I'm going to lose this conscript squad because I wasn't paying attention. That's also something you should never, ever, ever do. But yeah, do not, wait for him to die, wait for him, there he is. Do not ever do this. This was incredibly stupid and incredibly silly and is something you should never do ever. Especially if you have a minesweeper. I have a minesweeper squad. And I am going to try and repair it. It's not going to be in time, but that's okay. You'll notice I did get a mortar as well. And the mortar is there for a couple of reasons. One is to deal with MGs, and another is to deal with packs. It can be a little bit difficult on Pripyat to deal effectively with MGs. Just because if you'll notice, my opponent putting wire here drastically limits my range of motion. My opponent putting MGs up on the top, around this area, also in the middle, and even down here makes it extremely difficult for me to do anything movement-based with infantry that early in the game. I'm actually also going to lose my mortar, which is slightly sloppy of me, but if you'll notice, I actually have managed to recap a good deal of the map, and I'm making use of a lot of my conscript abilities, which is a prime thing you need to be doing in Company of Heroes 2. And what I mean by that is the conscript has a lot of very good abilities. I'm using the Guard Rifles anti-tank doctrine command tree, which is far and away the best 1v1 command tree for Soviets right now. I see zero reason in any of my games to ever go anything but Guard Rifles anti-tank, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it gives you a lot of flexibility with your strategy. I can go tier 1 with this strategy, or with this doctrine. I can go tier 2 with this doctrine. If I go tier 1 with this doctrine, I have Guard Rifles, which will give me fairly consistent infantry-based anti-tank. If I go tier 2, I'll be getting more conscripts, so I can make use of both Hit the Dirt and the SMG upgrade that the conscripts have, which is extremely cheap and extremely effective. A mere 20 munitions, and an extremely effective means of equalizing yourself with Panzer Grenadiers. Something people actually don't pay that much attention to is the extreme effectiveness of Hit the Dirt on conscripts. First of all, vanilla unupgraded conscripts using Hit the Dirt do probably about half damage to Panzer Grenadier squads that are charging and that are at full health. You put that conscript squad in cover and you've got about an even chance of coming out ahead in that engagement. Add some machine guns to the equation and you're coming out ahead using Hit the Dirt almost every single time unless your opponent throws grenades. And one downside of the Hit the Dirt ability is the fact that, is the fact that you can't actually move for a set period of time. I believe it's about 10 seconds. And that, of course, leaves you vulnerable to grenades. However, because of the way the current grenade animation works right now, there's actually not much of a chance of you dodging grenades, because latency combined with the really, really fast throw animation of Panzer Grenadier grenades makes it extremely difficult to actually dodge those grenades. So with that in mind, you almost lose nothing by using Hit the Dirt in nearly every engagement. It's best to get inside your opponent's capping zone if your opponent is trying to cap a point, and then using Hit the Dirt there and forcing your opponent to stop the cap, because of course having one of your squads in a point your opponent is capping effectively stops the cap, and then allowing you to deal a lot of damage, which is another, of course, very useful thing for conscripts, which a lot of people don't feel are that strong in the late game, but with the proper upgrades can definitely be. Another conscript ability that is essential for anyone who's building a lot of conscripts, which is something this strategy of course requires, is using URA as much as possible in the late game to increase the speed at which your infantry units get to points on the map. It can be very effective, getting your units from retreating to back on the field quicker, getting your units into cover spots to prevent your opponent from capping, or to get to a favorable location before your opponent is able to get there himself. There are a lot of excellent uses for URA in the mid game. It's extremely cheap, only 5 munitions. You have, generally speaking, a lot of munitions in the late game as the Soviets, and it gives you a nice little dump for those munitions on top of using AT grenades and using or upgrading SMGs, getting Molotovs, which I believe I have not gotten yet. Molotovs are something I get with this strategy a bit later in the game. It's not something I generally get always, but it's something I get when I have enough money and I don't have really necessarily anything else to build, but I want a little bit more effectiveness with my infantry. However, this is pretty much the end of this first game. I'm going to jump into game number 2, and we're going to see a slightly more difficult follow-up from the Wehrmacht player. I'll see you next time. Alrighty guys, welcome back. This is going to be game number 2. This is a game against Wayne Gacy, who is, of course, an austere player. This is the same map, Pripyat, however, opposite starting position, and we'll see how the strategy modifies itself very slightly, though not all that much in the grand scheme of things. It becomes slightly easier to move around the map just because we don't have to deal with this big water opening. Instead, we have a relatively small water opening up here that we can cut off by walking from about here to straight over here, which increases, or rather reduces, the time it takes for us to get to this area of the map, increases the speed at which our infantry can move over there. So in that sense, starting on this side is a little bit easier. However, it's a little bit easier as well for our opponent to harass this field point. So that's something we're going to have to keep in mind. You'll notice, as I said in the last game, sending my engineer straight to this field point, just want to get my fuel going as soon as physically possible to make my teching to T-34s just all that much easier, and making sure I have the requisite shock units that give me strength in the mid game to force my opponent back, which is something I'll talk about a bit later, because we'll actually notice in this game it won't be nearly as easy as it was in the previous game. There will be some hiccups, there will be some times when I do not necessarily have what I need or have what I want, and we'll see how this strategy is able to fairly easily adapt and react to those kind of situations. Now, as we notice, my capping order is almost exactly mirroring what I did in my previous game with this conscript squad down here. He will cap over here and then set himself up for heading into the middle. It's always a good idea to plan your capping orders to ensure your infantry can support one another. It's not necessarily as important to support this early engineer squad, because you know, chances are, unless your opponent is sloppy, or unless your opponent only sends out a pioneer squad, which is the situation right now, this engineer squad against anything but a pioneer is probably not going to do anything except deal a little bit of damage. So it's not as big of a deal to send the engineer squad out on its own. However, sending conscripts out on their own is a bit less ideal, because conscripts do have the ability, especially in numbers, to deal significant amounts of damage to early game austere units. But it's far better if they're together. One big reason for this is the fact that 1v1, a conscript squad doesn't necessarily always beat a grenadier squad. They're extremely similar units, conscripts and grenadiers. However, two things act in the favor of the grenadiers. First of all, their rifle damage is very excuse me, it's very slightly better than that of the conscripts. They can do a little bit more damage per shot on average than conscripts do, so over time they will be dealing a bit more damage. Furthermore, although they have the same amount of health as conscripts do, that health is distributed amongst 4 squad members rather than the conscript 6. And what this does is it means each individual grenadier squad is better able to survive an engagement than each individual conscript squad. And because of the way damage is calculated, and because of the way units deal damage, the damage a squad deals is directly proportional to the number of men in that squad. Because each individual man in the squad is doing his own damage. If I only have 3 men in my squad, I only have 3 men attacking, I only have 3 men actually dealing damage. That's half the effectiveness of a 6-man squad. Because the Grenadiers have less men in their squad, both their health and their damage are higher per man than those of the conscripts. So while losing an individual man hurts a lot more than in the conscripts case, they lose those individual men far less frequently than conscripts do, and for that reason they're relatively more difficult to fight against, and conscripts generally lose more often than they win early game against Grenadier squads. Now you'll notice I'm a little bit cut off right now, which isn't too big of a deal. My opponent has these 2 victory points in the middle, which I'm not too worried about at this point. However, this fuel point is something that I very much want to deny my opponent. You'll notice my opponent cut me off from my fuel, but actually wasn't able to recap it fully himself, and is now, or only now, going to recap it. You'll notice, however, my fuel is far less at this stage in the game than it was previously. It's 5 minutes in, I'm just now getting my tier 2 up, and my opponent showed me a scout car. So if we look back at my tier 1, I am going to very quickly upgrade anti-tank grenades, and this is going to give me a bit more effectiveness against this scout car. It's going to, of course, delay my tier 3, and it's going to in turn delay any vehicles I might want, but it's going to allow me to deal fairly harmlessly with this vehicle, and we'll actually see in a second how a combination of a little bit of lack of attentiveness on my opponent's part and true sight makes it relatively easy for you to actually take out these scout cars in the early game. They die very quickly to 2 AT grenades, and if you can get in range to deal 2 AT grenades, you can generally finish it off with small arms fire, which is what is going to happen right here. And now if we look at the map and we look at map control, I am at a profound advantage. I just now have my guard rifles anti-tank doctrine chosen, so I have hit the dirt, which is going to help me out a lot in this engagement. Of course, my opponent has a flamer coming, so I will have to retreat. However, I have the topmost fuel. I am sending units down to the bottom to harass my opponent's hold on this bottommost fuel. I also have these VPs in the middle, and I have a lot of the strat points around the middle as well. So I'm in a pretty good situation right now. However, a big problem is still my fuel income. My opponent was able to rather effectively deny me a lot of the fuel that I needed, or that I need in general, in order to tech. And if we notice, I actually do not have my tier 3 building up yet. 7 minutes into the game, this was about when I had started my tier 3 building in the previous game. However, fairly short on resources, and even though I would be able right now to actually get that building up, I don't really have the resources to build anything out of it, so I'm putting it off slightly. You'll see I got a mortar instead, just to give me something effective and useful to spend my manpower on, because I will be able to get my tier 3 building up, but I'm not going to be able to build anything out of it for a decent amount of time. Now, you'll notice actually last game, right before my T-34 came out, there was a point in time when my opponent was able to cap back nearly all of the map and was able to do a very good job of capping a lot and forcing me off the map, and that's a similar situation right here, because this is the weak point in the strategy. Almost all strategies have a point in their teching or in their development where they just they have weaker units. You have weaker units, you have weaker tech than your opponent, and that's generally the situation you run into right now with this strategy. You'll notice I'm cut off from both these fuel points. I have an opponent's unit heading up here to cap this point. My opponent was able to cap this middle, And this is because he has Panzer Grenadiers, which are fairly effective, and though hit the dirt can equalize engagements against them to a certain extent, it's not until you get submachine guns that conscripts are really able to hold their own against Panzer Grenadiers in the mid game. And you'll notice my CP's right here, 1 3/4, not quite at the 2 required for the SMG upgrade. So you'll notice my opponent pushing me off down here. I'm going to be able to push him off on the top. So my strong early game allowed me to transition through this phase with relatively little in the way of damage. I lost a bit of territory. My opponent's decapped a lot of stuff. He's going to cut me off again, which is going to hurt my ability to tech 2 tanks a little bit further. You'll see I am getting my tier 3 building, but if we look at my fuel income, I've got the manpower, I just don't really have the fuel. And you'll actually see a alternative of what you generally want to be doing, which is focusing as much as possible on T-34s. I am going to resort to T-70s in this case, simply because I need some return from that investment sooner rather than later. And I could wait an extra minute, 2 minutes, maybe even 3 minutes for the necessary fuel income before I can get my T-34s. But that would cost me a lot of time and not necessarily be the smartest thing to do. It would give my opponent a longer time with his advantage, which is something I want to limit as much as possible. I don't want him having an advantage for any longer than I have to allow him to have that advantage. So I want to, as quickly as possible, tilt the momentum, shift the momentum in my favor. The best way to do that is to get a tank, any tank, some kind of tank out on the field, and force my opponent to react to me instead of allowing or forcing myself to react to my opponent. So you'll notice I am harassing a little bit. That's one of the nice things of having so much infantry and such an infantry-centric strategy in the early game, is you can fairly easily harass around the map. I'm going to head down here on the bottom with a couple of units and try and force my opponent once again off this fuel point. I know he has a Panzer Grenadier squad down here, so I'm being a little bit cautious about that. My opponent was also smart in sending this flamethrower here to the middle, and you'll notice this is really the weak point right here. Look at my map control. I have no fuel on the top, I have no fuel on the bottom, I have my conscript squads finally with their submachine gun upgrades, but they've all retreated. I need to get back on the field and slowly work at regaining map control and regaining territory, which is something I am prepared to do, but don't necessarily have the perfect resources to do it. But I am getting my T-70 up, as you see up there on the top right, and with that T-70 I will be a little bit more mobile. I'll be a bit better able to harass my opponent, and I'll be a bit better able to respond to harassment from my opponent, which is a big problem with all of these Panzer Grenadiers on the field. Now, a nice thing, however, about a lot of Panzer Grenadiers is they're fairly expensive in terms of manpower, and expensive manpower units really delay teching in Company of Heroes 2, far more so than they did in vanilla Company of Heroes, because of the way upkeep works and the way you generally don't want to overproduce units, because they so drastically damage your manpower income, and there's no real way to restore it or make it any better aside from actually allowing those units to die, which is never something you want to do when you've invested a lot of manpower into a unit. You don't necessarily want it to just die on you, because you're losing veterancy, you're losing the manpower it costs to actually build the unit, etc., etc. Now, we saw a tier 3 transition from my opponent in the previous game. In this game, we're going to see a transition that causes a lot more difficulties for a lot more players, just judging from reading the forums and from experience as well. Going Panthers as an austere player is an extremely effective anti-tank measure and can cause a decent amount of headaches for a strategy such as this. Of course, I am relying a lot on my T-34s, and in this case on my T-70, to give myself flexibility and mobility and the ability to be around the map and harass a lot and more importantly, take these VPs back. Because if we look at the VP count right now, I'm actually behind, which, of course, it's not the end of the world. We're only 13 minutes into the game. The VP drain has been reduced, which, of course, benefits in this strategy's sense the austere player, because he wants to play a late game. He wants to get a couple Panthers up and then finally allow him to be aggressive consistently against my vehicles. I want to be trying as hard as I can to prevent him from doing that, and a big way to do that is to limit VPs and force my opponent to focus on the VPs and delay my opponent as much as possible. Now I see a lot of Pioneers and Grenadier squads coming down here on the bottom. As a result, I'm going to be diverting my T-70 down to the bottom. I also got an AT gun because I had a lot of manpower, not a lot of fuel, and I really need some kind of insurance against my opponent's tanks, if there are any. You'll notice I'm also planting a lot of mines in the middle. This is a very effective thing to do, especially on a map such as Pripyat, where there are a lot of funnels, a lot of choke points, and a lot of areas where you can be fairly certain your opponent is going to traverse when trying to cap or when trying to be aggressive with both vehicles and infantry. And though the Conscript grenades, or the Soviet grenades rather, aren't necessarily that effective against infantry, they're extremely effective against vehicles, almost always giving a critical, usually a damaged engine or destroyed engine critical. And it makes Soviet AT guns a lot more effective because they're able to get more shots off, and the Soviet AT gun has an inferior rate of fire to the austere pack, but does the same amount of damage. So you want to be able to keep that target in range as much as possible when using the Soviet AT gun. Now, one big problem with the Soviet AT gun is its lack of real damage against Panthers. Panthers have a lot of health, they have a lot of armor, and they're very difficult to kill outright. With that in mind, this strategy more focuses on delaying and constantly harassing and focusing on the support units rather than actually trying to straight up kill the Panther, because killing the Panther, you can spend a lot of resources trying to kill that Panther and probably not have all that much success. Now you'll notice the Panther is out on the field right now. A big tip-off that my opponent was going for this kind of follow-up was the lack of aggression in the mid-game. As I mentioned in my previous StratTalk episode, one big way to tell what your opponent is doing is to keep an eye on how aggressive he's being at any given time, because players that are aggressive can't necessarily tech as effectively, because an aggressive player is a player who's generally spending a lot of his money, most of his money and most of his time on reinforcing infantry squads, on upgrading infantry squads, on building up infantry strength so that he can be strong in that regard. A player who's teching necessarily does not have the same aggressive potential, because the teching player has to spend a lot more resources and a lot more time on units or on upgrades that don't give him any more unit strength. He's not building more Panzer Grenadiers, he's not building more packs, more mortars, more MGs, more Grenadiers, stuff like that. He's upgrading in the hopes of getting a payoff from that upgrade down the road, which is what this Panther is. However, a nice thing about that is the fact that we can exploit that by, instead of focusing on the Panther, which is really a damage sink, you're not going to get much done by focusing on that Panther and trying your hardest to actually kill the Panther, because if you don't kill it, you've given up a lot of manpower and a lot of time for something that your opponent can just repair for essentially free. And that's definitely not a good trade for you as the Soviet player. Now you'll notice I did lose, or I almost lost a Conscript squad, so I did decide to build a 5th Conscript squad in anticipation of losing that other Conscript squad. However, I ultimately did not end up losing the other Conscript squad, so in a normal game I probably wouldn't build this 5th Conscript squad, but I saw I was going to probably lose this squad, so I wanted to make sure I had another one on the way as soon as possible. But that's okay, it'll give me a bit more mobility in any case. Now you'll notice I have 2 AT guns in the middle. This is more than enough to prevent my opponent's Panther from being extremely aggressive and just straight charging my tanks, because I will be getting a second tank, a T-34, shortly. A big reason for this is what I mentioned before with focusing on the Panther's support. It's kind of the same for those of you who played Vanilla Company of Heroes. It's the same theory that you employ when fighting a King Tiger or when fighting a Tiger. Is those are extremely manpower intensive units that cost a lot. They cost a lot to tech up to. It's more so the case in Company of Heroes 2 because of course you need all of the tech, all of the buildings, and then both manpower and fuel to actually build Tigers and of course Panthers, which are extremely expensive. And if you can limit your opponent's support, you force your opponent to make a difficult choice, because he either has to replenish that support, which is going to set him behind in terms of vehicles, because he obviously can't build, he has to choose, because he only has so much manpower. This is doubly true in Company of Heroes 2, where, as I've mentioned over and over and over again, the way upkeep works is so incredibly different and so incredibly damaging for late game, just because it's so expensive a lot of the time to reinforce units and all that fun stuff. And manpower income later in the game is so drastically reduced a lot of the time that you want to force your opponent to make decisions that he doesn't want to make, such as, am I going to rebuild a Grenadier squad or reinforce a Grenadier squad? I don't have much manpower income right now. I don't have much manpower, period, and I really want this tank. I really want this unit, or I just committed a lot of money to this unit and now I don't have much in the way of money to reinforce squads. So it's your primary goal is to target the support. Force your opponent's Tiger to move around. You'll notice all of the damage I dealt, though not fatal, didn't even get him down to half health. I haven't seen that Tiger in a long time, or that Panther in a long time. He's most likely sitting back here repairing, but because I've invested in units, you see I'm getting my T-34 right now, I've invested in units that are ideally suited to countering my opponent's support. I have 5 conscript squads, a lot of them with veterancy, all but 1 in fact. I have 2 AT guns as a defensive measure against my opponent's Panther should he try and be aggressive, and I also have 2 tanks which are extremely effective at anti-infantry duty, and these tanks are primarily going to be targeting support while my AT guns try their hardest to damage and delay the Panther. I'm going for VPs at this point. You'll notice my opponent's VP is down to 181. I have an AT gun moving into position to deflect this Panther. I also have infantry. Panthers are not all that effective against infantry. They are extremely versatile and extremely good at soaking up damage, but not necessarily that good at dealing damage to non-vehicle units. It's never a good idea to try and fight a Panther with any sort of Soviet vehicle. Excuse me. I generally avoid Soviet Tier 4 simply because I find it far too expensive and ineffective for the role it should provide, which is to be an anti-tank tier. It doesn't really perform that role all that well, and you can get relatively the same performance out of Tier 2 AT guns for a fraction of the cost, and while allowing yourself to tech up to something a bit easier to deal with, like T-34s, which can do a very good job against my opponent's infantry. As you can see right here, my opponent's Tiger isn't really able to get close enough to the AT gun because my T-34 is going to be there to counter the infantry. My opponent needs to ideally decrew that AT gun before he can move in with the Panther, because an AT gun and a T-34 with good micro is almost always going to be bad for the Panther. Even with his massive amounts of health, his slow movement speed, the decent amount of damage the AT gun can dish out, and the mobility of the T-34 all work against the Panther and his health. Now you'll notice I have pretty dominant map control right now. Because of my opponent's investment in that tiger, he doesn't really have anything that can match up against my infantry. And I've split up my vehicles so that I'm forcing my opponent to react to what I'm doing. My opponent can't really be that mobile with his tiger. Tigers are fairly slow, especially when there's this big gap of water right here. That makes moving a tiger down to this bottom area to deal with this squad or this tank fairly difficult. And as long as I can stay attentive and ensure I'm constantly reversing out of Faust, which I fail to do right here and then get Fausted, even now it's going to be a little bit of time and a little bit more money before my opponent can actually take care of that T70, in which case I'll be able to deal more damage, delay my opponent a bit more, drop my opponent's VPs, which are now precariously low at a mere 65. And from this point forward, it's mostly an academic exercise. It's very difficult for my opponent to deal any real damage to me because of the excellent support I have right now with all of my tanks, with my infantry, and with their spread out positions around the map. I have a conscript squad down here to defend. I took a little bit of damage with my T-34, but that's okay because I have conscript squads up here. And I have a whole lot of munitions in the bank, so I have a lot of AT grenades at my disposal. I also have all 3 of the victory points still, and with my opponent's victory points ticking down ever so quickly, it's pretty much checkmate rather at this point for the austere player. And that's one thing that I really like a lot about this strategy, is its ability to perform well in all phases of the game. It has a very strong early game with the conscripts. It has a slight weakness in the mid game, which we saw earlier when my opponent has his tier 2 units out, his Panzer Grenadiers, and I don't necessarily have my conscripts in a strong enough state to actually deal with them. At a point like that, it is possible for my opponent to maintain a foothold and come back a little bit more into the game, which of course makes things a bit more difficult for me. However, the later the game gets, the stronger the Soviets actually get with this strategy, because we have a lot of delaying tactics available at our disposal, or to our disposal. We have hit the dirt for conscripts, we have our AT guns, which, though not necessarily the biggest damage dealers, can delay heavy vehicles and deal a lot of damage to lighter tier 3 vehicles, as we saw in our previous game. And then we of course have our T-34s and in some cases T-70s, which are able to harass, delay, and drain manpower as much as possible. And with that, this episode of StratTalk is going to come to a close. I hope you guys enjoyed this. As always, I appreciate questions, comments, concerns, all that fun stuff. Do please check out the replays if you are at all curious about this style. Ask questions. There will be links in the bottom for any of you who are curious. And with that, I'll see you guys next time.